A fateful day in New York City shocked a virtually dead industry back to life. As our metaphorical defibrillator, the Nintendo Entertainment System revived video games in America, but in a much more profound way, it transformed the trade forever. By the late quarters of 1983, the arcade culture had collapsed, and gaming was a faded fad that had come and gone. The masses had lost interest in an even bigger bevy of 4-kilobyte crap, consumer confidence shaken by oversaturation of poor product. Games and more games, bad games and porn games. The bubble had burst, and the video game lost its long-term viability. But meanwhile, in Japan, and quite frankly, the rest of the world, the crash had no import. The game industry survived, and was in fact strengthened by the release of the Family Computer System, or the Famicom, in '83. With a massive success on Nintendo's hands, the company sought to secure an American counterpart. The problem was that the market had been murdered. No one cared about games anymore, and the thought of another home console, let alone by a Japanese company whose only real contribution to gaming was an arcade hit called Donkey Kong, was itself a gag reflex. Nintendo was nothing in America, and so they went to Atari to market their machine, but talks failed, and Nintendo decided to crack the market alone. October 18th, 1985, the NES, a redesigned Famicom with a new name and a new skin, tested in NYC, and the response, following an outpour of insider skepticism, was overwhelming. The games were at last held to a standard, Nintendo's official seal of quality, trying to restore the consumer's faith in what would now be a regulated business. The most seminal franchises of all time found their legs. In a stark contrast to the Cold War destruction of the space shooter, the genre that had defined the arcades, Super Mario Bros. Satisfied the child's inability to sit still, relating movement as never before, popularizing the platformer. The Legend of Zelda, as the perfect parallel to Super Mario Bros., spoke to the kids' aspirations of adventure. Metroid, Mega Man, Final Fantasy, all of these groundbreaking titles began on the NES and continue today, more than 20 years later. In order to win back shoppers, Nintendo was done with decoys. The facade of exaggerated cover art on video game boxes was a mistake they were not going to make. Most of their covers accurately represented the game's graphics. In another foundational precedent, the NES's target audience was clear. Nintendo was marketing towards kids, and they would forever maintain that mantra. If there was one knock against the NES, it's that its hardware was not ideally constructed. We've all at some point or another had the frustrating experience of emptying our lungs into the cranny of our console. Blowing on game packs is an infamous practice of playing retro. Of course, the hardware of this original Nintendo did leave one notable legacy: the D-pad. Though the NES would not see a nationwide release until the following year, New York City's test release was an unimaginable sigh of relief that this was no fad. The video game had failed in America, but it still had a future in America. The Nintendo was the artifact of a radical changeover. Just as the name Atari had been synonymous with video games from '77 to '83, Nintendo was now the industry. What was once American-dominated was now monopolized by the Japanese. The NES established the business structure still standing today, restoring consumer confidence in the medium. And the product of a different culture innovated in gameplay terms in a deeply cinematic sense. Games were telling stories, no matter how rudimentary, and were tapping into our constructive emotions, the freedom of running and jumping and discovering, in a way that blowing up space fighters in a more cynical age had been unable to do so. October 18th, 1985, one of the most vital days in gaming.